Hi guys, and today it is sewing time. And for the first step of our sewing, we're going to need two pieces. Now this piece is the skirt front piece, which I've folded over just for spacing, which you'll recognise from this curved edge that it has. And we also need our pocket piece, which also has this curved edge, which is to match up with your front skirt piece. So first of all, we're going to need to pin these two pieces right sides together. So just lay your pocket piece on top of your front piece, and like I said, this piece is folded over at the moment, but we're just going to be pinning through these two layers here. So first and foremost, you're going to want to make sure that you're matching up your notches, those notches that we cut into our fabric pieces during the cutting phase of this sew along. So you'll have a notch at the top and one at the bottom, and let's get pinning. Now that we have everything pinned in place, we're going to sew along this edge, and we're going to be using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and my preference of stitch length is 2.5 on my sewing machine. So with our sewing machines, we want to line up the edge of our fabric so that our seam will be 5/8 of an inch, drop down your foot, and then I also like to anchor my needle before I start sewing. Another thing I like to do is a couple of stitches of back stitch to anchor my thread just at the beginning of every seam that I sew. And most importantly here, when we're sewing along this seam, whenever we get to a needle, we need to remove that needle, because sewing over needles is never a good thing. Those things can ping off and hit you in the face, or they can even get sucked down into your sewing machine, which can be very, very expensive to fix. So always make sure that you don't sew over your pins, that you remove them as you go. When you get to the end of the seam, I like to do a few stitches of back stitch again to anchor the thread at this end. Lift up your needle and cut those threads. Once we've finished sewing it, this is what our lovely seam will look like, 5/8 of an inch along the curve of the pocket. Now for our next step, we're going to want to trim down this seam because it is going to be folded over and inside the pocket. So we want it to have as little bulk as possible so that it will lie nice and flat when we fold the pocket over. So we're going to be cutting this down to about half of the width that it already is. So we'll have around about 1/4 of an inch of seam left. To give this seam allowance a little more flexibility, because we're going to be turning it over on itself, another thing that we'll want to do is cut some small notches into it, just because again, this will help it to lie flat. So taking our scissors, we're cutting small notches right up to the sewing line, but not through it. Be very, very careful to not cut through the seam that you've just sewn, but pretty much cut almost just a few millimeters away from that. We do that along the entire curved edge of this seam to give us lots of flexibility for when we're going to turn this piece of fabric over on itself. And you can see how after cutting these little notches, this seam is suddenly so much more flexible than it was before. Now we're going to be doing some understitching, which basically prevents the insides of the pocket from rolling to the outside. So what we want to do is make sure that we're pressing our seam down against our pocket piece, which is the piece under my right hand. So this piece here is the pocket, and we want to make sure that our seam is lying flat against it. And like I said, we'll be stitching this seam allowance down to the pocket to prevent any rolling of the inside of the pocket to the outside. So our stitch length is still 2.5, and we just want to go nice and easy when we're doing this understitching. I tend to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line crease here, as you can see. What I'm doing is just checking as I sew that all of my seam allowance underneath is lying to the right side, so under my pocket piece, which is the piece on the right of the needle here. It's a little bit difficult to show in the video, but as you can see, I'm going very slowly, smoothing out the pocket piece as I go and just making sure all the time that that seam allowance is still lying to the right of the crease. So what I'm doing is stitching that seam allowance onto the pocket piece. And here we have the finished understitching. Now as you can see, I've got that line of stitching that's going all the way through the whole seam allowance and through the pocket piece, which is just here. And this is what it looks like from the outside. So that line of stitching is going to go inside the pocket as it's actually through the pocket piece. For our next step, we're going to want to press this piece now that we've understitched it. So if you can see, that understitching that we've done is gone to the inside of the pocket, as this is the wrong way up. And when we press this, we want to make sure that that understitching and also the crease of the seam is all going to the inside of the skirt. So we just want to make sure that everything is lined up, all of the edges of our pattern pieces are all neat and tidy, and then we're going to go ahead and press. Look at that crisp pressed edge, yay! Now for my denim version of the Hollyburn skirt, I'm adding top stitching on the pockets, the waistband and the hem. And for that I'm using this special top stitching thread, which is pretty much just the same as normal cotton thread. It's just a lot thicker, which means it shows up a lot better for top stitching. So if you're using top stitching thread, you'll want to replace the top thread in your sewing machine with that top stitching thread, but you can leave your bobbin with the same thread that you've been using for your regular sewing. And I still keep my stitch length at 2.5 for top stitching. As a preference, I like to top stitch about 1/4 inch away from the edge of whatever I'm top stitching, which is what I'm doing here. And this is what that finished top stitching looks like. Isn't it pretty? I love top stitching so much. Next up, we need to finish sewing together our pocket. So right now we have our pocket piece on the top here and we have our skirt piece underneath. And what we're going to do is fold our pocket piece in half along the little fold line that we marked on it earlier. And don't worry if you don't have that line marked, because you should have a little notch at the top and the bottom of your pocket piece, so you'll easily be able to see exactly where you'll need to fold that piece. You're also going to want to line up your side notch with where the pocket edge is, and we're going to sew along this bottom line again at 5/8 of an inch with our regular stitch length, 2.5. So let's pin that together and sew it, although apparently I forgot to film that part. And here we have our finished seam running along the bottom of the pocket. And we want to finish this raw edge now, and that can be done in lots of different ways. You could just cut it with pinking shears, you could sew across it with a zigzag stitch, that works really well and is super easy. If you want to use a French seam for this pocket, I would hang on until I show you my French seam tutorial, which will be coming up soon. Just hold off sewing this seam at all until then. For my denim version of this skirt, I want something quite robust and strong, so I am going to be sewing up this raw edge with a serger. Now, a serger uses 4 bobbins of thread to enclose a raw edge while you're sewing, and it also cuts off any excess fabric as you go. So there you can see that little strip of excess fabric being cut off. We are nearly there with sewing our pockets. As you can see, I've got my top stitching here, my understitching inside the pocket, and if I turn this over, you can see my lovely serged edge, which is enclosing all of those raw edges, so nothing is going to fray and unravel or anything like that. So for our next step, we need to baste the pocket in place to stop it from moving when we sew it. So along this little edge here and this little edge here, we're going to use long basting stitches so that when we start sewing all our skirt pieces together, this pocket's not going to shift. This part won't open and this part won't flap open, and everything will just stay nice and neat and where it's supposed to be. So let's get those pins out again. Just need a couple of pins this time because there's not a huge amount that we need to actually sew. And let's go to the sewing machine. Change your sewing machine to the longest stitch length that you can, so mine is a 4. And then you just need to sew those basting stitches. Top tip, don't forget to change your stitch length back to 2.5 after you have finished your basting. And there you have it, our pocket pieces are done. Thanks for watching. Please comment below if you have any queries or questions at all, and I will see you next time when we're going to be sewing all of our skirt pieces together. Bye for now!